in a positive way, a little disassociated, because not every thought, every emotion, and every sensation is actually accurate.
Right.
So, and in that post-traumatic stress disorder, or what's called in plasticity, the limbic trauma loop, you know, there was a book in the 80s, Your Body Never Lies? That's not true. Your body can lie to you all the time. If you're in a falsified threat state, and it's going to tell you, you're going to have all these sensations, you're going to have all these feelings, you're going to have all these thoughts, and there's a good percentage of them that are bullshit. But they're very, very convincing. So, that's a big subject that we'll get to at some point, but I want to highlight the fact that the cognitive control network is involved in it's the CEO. It's going to delegate responsibility. It's the time to do a task. The cognitive control comes online. It pushes the default mode network aside and takes over. And when it takes over, it's able to help a person be not only cognizant, but also evaluative of the experience. So that's the observer. Another short one is, if the person can't turn it on, it, meaning it, then reinforce the cognitive control network. If they can't turn it off, meaning they're always in task, default mode network, because default mode network is when you go out of task. So if somebody can't turn it off, reinforce default mode network. If they can't turn it on, like you're working with motivation, you're working with procrastination, you're working with all these kinds of things, make sure that the cognitive control network is fine-tuned and calibrated. They're called resting state networks. Meaning when they're not operative, they go into a resting state. But the resting state is not an idle state. Resting state just means that they're not actively involved in task, but when they're in the resting state, they're calibrating and tuning, that they're prepared. You know, it's like the trumpet player that is ready, that when it's time, he or she jumps in, boom, they're ready. They're aware, and then if it's like a cello, maybe they're tuning, they're off tune a little bit, ding, bong, 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 okay, I'm ready. So the resting state networks, that's what they're called as a whole. If you see RSN, that's the acronym that's used for them a lot. Resting state network means that they go in and out of task. They go in and out of dominance. So when they're not being called on, they're in a resting state, meaning they're potential. But resting doesn't mean idle. So you have these two. Default mode network, cognitive control network. Okay. You have this other one called the limbic network. Since we got started 10 minutes late, we might finish 10 minutes late. Right?
It's called
Limbic. Used to be called paleomammalian, used to be called reptilian brain. Now, generally, the limbic network. It's a configuration of a number of different localizations. It's not one piece. That's why it's called a network. It's like an Olympic team, you know. They play, you know, for all these different teams, but they also come together as a special team. So you have the limbic network. Limbic network is a really, really, really big deal. It deals in that, a lot of it in the emotional realm, a lot in long-term memory, and your other thing, olfactory.
Olfactory, yeah.
Yeah.
That's where it takes place.
Yeah, the limbic network, the processing of smell. I'm pointing to Robert because he's got a beautiful line of aromatherapy. The smell thing actually is incorporated into the limbic system.
Right.
When you see the light, the flashing, flickery, and when you hear the sound, One is going visual cortex with the frontal, and the other is going cerebellum. They're integrated in the limbic system.
So,
Hmm?
how does that work?
How does that work? It's very clever. But because survival, reptilian brain, like the old brain. Then it was called paleo-mammalian. No, that's not like the paleo diet. But now it's called the limbic network for the most part. When stimulation comes flooding in, and it comes into the central nervous system, proceeding up into the brainstem, past the brainstem, the first configuration is the limbic system. And its job, primarily, although it has numerous tasks, is to designate this flood of stimulation as either being threatening or safe. It's at the base level of survival that the first encounter of stimulation, when it comes in, it gets a designation. It's an immigration thing. Threat, no threat. And according to its designation in the limbic system, and this is in flickering milliseconds, it's happening right now, if it triggers threat, there's a feeling state that results that is an alerted, vigilant preparedness for threat. And if it's non-threat, then there's a comforting, open socialization tendency. And these are the two dispositions. As it then volcanically goes up into the higher brain, into the cortex, then it's assigned thoughts. So we assign thoughts that fit the feelings. We are feeling creatures that think, not thinking creatures that feel. And smell enters in at that level. That's the olfactory integration is in the limbic system. Deb?
But then how do the hormones come into play, like adrenaline for the flight or fight?
Yeah.
And then the oxytocin for
That's the biochemistry that is attendant to the sense of threat or non-threat. They come after that. The limbic system is making a decision based on past experience. And this is the problem. People that have deep trauma, they end up, in the language now, although it has different names, they end up with what's called the limbic trauma loop, where the limbic system is now biased. It's prejudiced. It's been traumatized, and now is choosing a better safe than sorry attitude. So stimulation that comes in that is at first similar to the nature of the trauma immediately triggers threat. And then that gets reinforced, and it becomes a loop because it signals threat, they feel threat, they think threat, they respond threat, and it begins to organize itself. The reality proves itself.
Even though there's no threat.
Even though there's no threat. It's just that it's similar enough by category to the original significant trauma that the past is always in the present. And then what happens is the category, let's say it was exposure to toxic chemicals, which is very common. That's enough. It can be a serious virus. It can be physical sexual abuse. It can be the terror of war. What constitutes a significant trauma is highly individualistic. But once that is significant enough, the limbic system, because it's geared for survival, short-term survival, it says, hey, this sensation, this stream of information is similar enough to the bad thing that happened, threat. And the body goes into that, and then the cascade of the hormones, the cortisols, all these things will arise as a feeling state before you have any thought. So what happens is the thought tends to follow the feeling, and you will rationalize the fact that this really is a threat, and he was coming on to me in a weird way, and and that's why I screamed and slammed the door in his hand, or on and on, whatever. I'm just making things up, right? So then what happens is that the category of the threat, let's say it was toxic chemical, which is not the example I gave, it starts to broaden, where it's not just like an actual toxic chemical, it's like almost any chemical, like a fragrance. Suddenly, the fragrance is triggering a threat response. And you go into sympathetic dominance, and all the hormones and the neurochemicals happen, and up comes something into your head, boom, 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 boom. And that's why it's called a limbic trauma loop. You get into this loop where the limbic system is lying to you. But it's based on the principle of short-term survival. And the rationale is, well, you think, well, that's a real dumb system. It gets into all this trouble. If you don't survive short-term threat, what's the difference? You're dead. So better to have an overreactive short-term survival response than end up dead. So our systems, because old things that work, we tend to keep. We don't throw them away. We have this limbic, or call it paleo-mammalian, or call it reptilian, this very basic neuroceptive system that is always evaluating threat or safety. Do we go into a vigilant protection, or do we go into positive socialization? These are the two basic choices. And we can think a whole lot, but the fact is, underneath the thinking is a feeling state. And underneath the feeling state is this very fundamental. This is why smell is so incredibly powerful. Why a smell can bring back the past like nothing else can. Because the olfactory integration is not at a higher level. It's right at that paleo-mammalian limbic level. That's where we process the smells. Yes?
So this light therapy can treat that?
The limbic network is completely compositionally encoded into the NeuroLight. So it's one of the things that you use when you help to reorient the limbic system back towards a less biased reaction to stimulation.
How about the food? Do you have to use that too, or it's just the light?
We're going to be talking about applications a lot tomorrow, and integration, right? So what I'm wanting to do right now, and I'll finish up because it's 5. We'll finish around 10 or 15 after 5.
Thank you.
Those are the 3 biggies. I call those the big 3. Default mode network, cognitive control network, and the limbic network. There's a high level of use in those, and they're powerful. You can't just play around with them, have this, have that. These are used when you're working in a game plan, when you're moving towards something, and you want to develop it, where you're really working with not thrills, but skills. It's when you're working. This is in that realm of the change that happens over months, weeks to months, and eventually maybe years, where you're actually able, and it was thought to be impossible, you can actually change the emotional disposition of a person. A person can actually be different. Just like they can become negatively different. Like after trauma, or in some cases, famously with women with post-menopause, that it's like a different personality for some people. You can see people that have significant trauma or illness in their life. And it's true and if you haven't experienced it, it's true, that there are people that just become different. It's like a different person. The emotional disposition is altered so much, they just don't behave the same. And that's actually malleable. That's part of neuroplasticity. So getting into that work, this is serious work. I mean, this takes dedication, it takes time, it takes maturation. This is not just following some menus that are there. But this is the potential of neuroplasticity in general. It's the potential of movement, mental and sensory. It's the potential built into the NeuroLight. So those are the big three. Now there are two others. I'll be a little bit more quick, but these are fascinating. I mean, these are really fascinating. The dorsal attention network and the ventral attention network. The other two I said were two people sharing one chair, one on, one off. The dorsal attention and the ventral attention are more like dance partners. Like they tango together. So they're complementary. Dorsal and ventral just refers to the anatomical location of some of the structures. So it's not, we could have given them some other name, but some anatomists got to it first. The dorsal attention network becomes dominant when the task involves focus. Boom. But focus without effort. It's the ability to do that. The camera lens goes into focus. So the dorsal attention network is really marvelous when there is a demand to refine or strengthen or reinforce the ability to maintain focus. For those of you in the Buddhist tradition, this is all involved. This is like the shamatha phase, if you practice any of those things. That's effortless focus. Not focus with effort, but it's this ability to go and be there. That's focus. The ventral attention is field. Field and focus. There are some people that when they focus, they can't have any noise around them. They can't, they're like, no, I'm focusing. Right? And that's when in the temples they put that person next to the squeaky door where everybody's walking in and out and in and out and in and out. The ventral attention is about field. Because, and this is the way it's explained. It's kind of like, caveman with the club stuff. But that if, as an animal, which we are, if you're in the wild and you're focusing on something, you also have to maintain the capacity of an awareness of the field of context. Because you can be there focusing and along comes a predator and you're dead. So the ability to have focus while maintaining the context of the field is the dance of the dorsal attention network and the ventral attention network. So following the Buddhist thing, the dorsal attention is the shamatha practices. The ventral is the vipassana practices, where you're open to the flow of experience, but you can still stay in the moment. So it's focus and field. You want the ventral and the dorsal. The dorsal is the focus, the ventral is the field. You want that ability to be able to be present and there and do what you're doing while still maintaining a sense of context as to where you are and what's happening. It's so elegant, it's so for people that they can't maintain focus if there's any distraction at all. You've got to reinforce the ventral attention network so that they can be open to the field of context without being disturbed. And in the opposite, the people that are always being attracted to everything around and they can't focus, then of course that's the dorsal attention network. But the fact is that they shouldn't be exclusionary like the default in the cognitive control. These are the tango partners. They slow dance together. What you want is, like right now, I want the ability to maintain focus on the topic, stay informative, cohesive with my thinking, but at the same time be sensitive to what's happening in the room and what time it is and the temperature and how you're feeling. That's focus and field. That's dorsal and ventral attention network. Those two are really beautiful because you can work elegantly, and they're really used a lot with people moving progressively through meditative practices, or your John, your mystical question thing, all of that. Those two networks are a real big deal. They're a real big deal. Yes?
So you'd have somebody do 11 minutes of one and then 11 minutes of the other?
We'll talk about methodology tomorrow. But I just want you to know about the networks right now, because there's not only one way of using it. On the website, if you go into, I think it's level 3, there's a 2-part, well, I did them in PowerPoint, but they're converted to Google Slides. It's so big it's in 2 parts, an entire presentation on how to use the NeuroLight to develop meditative practices. It tells you step by step, do this, do that, do this, do that, do this, do that, do this. I'm not saying it's the only way, but it's a well-developed, fully developed process if you want to see it. Okay, the last 2. One is the visual network. And this is a really fascinating one, because part of the visual has an awful lot to do, again, with self and other, because there's a special aspect of the visual cortex that is purely devoted to facial recognition. And that facial recognition, combined with the default mode network where we define the me and the other, it's really at the base of so much work to do with people that deal with interaction and socialization, introverts, extroverts, people that have social phobias, all these kinds of things, where you work with the sense of me, but you also work with, you would never think about it, with the visual network, because in the visual network is face recognition. And this whole thing of selfies right now blows my mind, because it's like the 2 at one, the me as a face. Up until recently, really, humans never knew what they looked like. Photograph mirrors, shining like a still water pond. Through most of humankind, we didn't know what we looked like. We just had a very basic kind of impression that we looked more or less like this. And now this whole thing of, staring at all of these me's relentlessly is extraordinary. I don't know what it's doing to the psyche. But anyway, the visual network. So one is, yes, it's about visual, but it's also working with what usually we'll call imagination, the mind's eye, what you see, right? What you visualize, what you imagine. You can work with the visual network. And that, combined with other brain skill sessions about creativity and all these things, all of a sudden, vision. We talk about having visions. Visions is a kind of seeing. And the visual cortex has external seeing, but it also has facial recognition, but it also is in that place of, can I see it in my mind's eye or not? So it's a very intriguing brain network to work with when you're working with people in terms of socialization, self-identification, creativity, imagination, visual artists. It's something. The last one is the somatomotor. And that's a brain network that works at integrating the general somatic experience with a mind state. You could say, for people that aren't able, that disassociate from their body. This is one of the dimensional degradations in the limbic trauma loop, where a person moves further and further and further away from threat. They move past fight or flight. They go into the deepest, if you know polyvagal theory, they go into the deepest protection, the oldest protection of all. It's called play dead. There's fight, flight, but more deep than that is freeze. And there are animals that specialize in that. You don't even know they're there. a couple weeks ago, I was with my gibbons, and they're going, woo, they're telling me that there was an alert because I have a little familiarity with their language. I'm looking around, okay, usually it's a snake. I couldn't see any. I said, guys, there's nothing here. No, and they're right over the top, and they're saying, woo, 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 woo. Right? I'm saying, hey, I'm right here. I don't see it. And they're both there because there are two of them. I'm thinking, well, okay, I don't know. So I just stayed there for a while, 3, 4, 5 minutes, and this big toad moved. And it looked exactly like all the dried leaves. Right? It was completely frozen. And during these things, the animals that specialize in this, heart rate goes way down. Breathing goes way down. As a matter of fact, in some cases, they can even suspend breathing and heart rate. They can just... And we have that in us. That's the... When even fight or flight doesn't work, and the threat is pervasive and relentless, then the person begins to go through what's typically called disassociation, where they disassociate. I'm not here anymore. I play dead. You can look right at me. I'm not here. You can do whatever you want. I'm not here. And there is a disassociation from soma, from their body. The person disassociates. They don't feel their body anymore. That's why sometimes they'll inflict pain or razor cuts or whatever just to feel something, just to prove I have a body. Even pain is better than feeling nothing. So, there's a progression. So in those complicated states, working with the somatomotor, and the somatosensory would be really helpful. I just don't have the numbers on that. But working with the somatomotor, what they need to do, and typically what they don't do, is they need to move. Typically they don't like moving. That's freezing. That's the whole point. You're not supposed to move. That toad, I don't know how long it would have taken, but that toad was not... I didn't see it. I'm telling you, it's like your foot is right there. I'm looking right there. I only saw leaves, I swear, because my mind says those are leaves, so those are leaves. Nothing's moving. The color is perfect. Everything's the shape. And after a while, and it was big. It was as big as my hand. I think, how can I not even see that?
Because it was camouflage.
It's totally camouflage, and it's no breathing, no nothing, no sound, nothing. It was playing dead. And that's the oldest, the most archaic survival technique and threat was, I'm not here. You can't see me.
How do you think the gibbons sensed it? By smelling it?
They probably saw it move. Or they perceive better than I do, which I can guarantee they do. I can guarantee. When they look into the forest, what they see is like when I look at a book and they see me looking at a book. They've got no idea what I'm getting from the book. When they look at the forest, I have no idea what they're getting from the forest. Okay.
So is the somatomotor also just moving in space?
Yeah, it's if a person needs to ground, if they need to come into their body, it's the idea. It works very well in neuroplasticity when you're using movement integration into the goal. So the somatomotor is basically about the fact you have a body and your body moves, and it's associating the mind state with the somatic state of animation. And in the deep limbic trauma loop and post-traumatic stress syndrome, the disassociation can be so strong that there's no sense of a body. The me is something, it's amorphous. The me is very difficult to define because we basically define ourselves corporally. I mean, here I am. Look at my face. So these brain networks are potent. Don't use them willy-nilly. Try to understand. Read about them, study about them. There's information in the online learning. They're in the brain gym. 5:15. That's the deal. Thank you very much. Tomorrow, we'll do it again for those of you able to come here. Tomorrow is in 2 parts. We're going to be starting off with the brain skills for the first half-ish, and then the second half is discussing all the things about integrating these into actual practical applications. Hints, guidelines, rules, ideas, and also for those of you that haven't had session experiences, we'll try to work some of those in so that you have an experiential reference as part of the process. And again, it's 9 to 5, same deal. Try to come on time if you can. And other than that, rest up. Thank you for your attention today. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.